Law, order, truth, confession. This is, in part, what we expect from police officers. The assumption at the bottom of a cop drama is the idea that there is an objective truth and that those who break the law should be punished. But what if someone believes that there is a law outside of the state? What if they dole out punishments for perceived transgressions? What if they take on the role of judge and enact the wrathful vengeance of a skewed ideology? In today's episode of Horror Joy, we investigate two films that demonstrate how the drive for answers can ultimately lead to one's own destruction. First, we discuss David Fincher's 1995 masterpiece, Seven, in which a soon-to-be-retired detective and a newly arrived transfer pursue an anonymous killer via quasi-theological clues based on the Seven Deadly Sins. We then turn to Bong Joon-ho's 2003 Memories of a Murder, where we follow an inept detective squad on the trails of South Korea's first serial killer during the tumultuous late 1980s.
Both films shine a light on the depravity of the world. One highlights this depravity in terms of fallenness and the sinful path away from perfection or God. One demonstrates the almost comical corruption of local police officers, lacking in resources. Both show the significant tension between the desire for truth and the pursuit of justice. Both, too, remind us of the many ways in which women's bodies pay the costs of male desire and ambition. So, grab your detective kit and come along as we travel the long way out of hell up to the light. But make sure to keep your head along the way and don't dropkick anyone, lest you become vengeance, lest you become wrath. This is Horror Joy. We're your hosts. I'm Brian Onishi.
And I'm Jeff Stoyanoff. We're two professors celebrating the emotional and intellectual joys of horror.
All right, y'all, we are back with another episode of Horror Joy. Today, we are tackling cop horror. We've got two films on the way, classic movies. One of them is Seven from 1995. This is an incredible movie. If you haven't seen it, I don't know what to tell you. This is one of the best, I think, detective movies out there. It was directed by David Fincher and written by Andrew Kevin Walker, who, it turns out, is from Altoona. So, hey, Andrew Kevin Walker, if you're out there, let us know. Let's get you on the pod because we are here in Altoona. That's where we are. We are also going to be talking about Memories of a Murder by Bong Joon-ho. Bong Joon-ho is one of the best directors, I think, out there working, Korean director, lots of Korean language films. Memory of a Murder is a Korean language film, and we will jump into that. I really like Bong Joon-ho's work, probably most well known for Parasite, won Best Picture a few years ago. Snowpiercer is also a popular one, and I absolutely love The Host. So we'll talk about that as we get there. For now, though, I think we're going to jump into Seven. Again, this is a classic film, David Fincher, 1995. There's just something so unsettling about everything that happens in this movie. From the constant rain of the city, this feeling that we're nowhere at all. The city is never named. This is something that I think is worth describing. In part, I think we're playing another version of Is This Horror, which is a game we've played quite a bit here on Horror Joy, starting with Jaws and Severance and a few others, maybe Alien. But is this horror? I kind of think so, right? I mean, it's one of the most unsettling movies that I've ever seen. Something that I think we should talk about is the way that violence works in this movie. You see very little of it, if any. All of the murders are committed off camera, except for the final one. And there's something really terrifying about a story and a director who can make you feel such unease without showing you the direct violence. And I think that's something that Fincher is doing here at a really, really high level. So I want to talk about the violence. I want to talk about the city. Where are we? What's that? Why is it anonymous? I want to talk about, Jeff, you have brought this up, the idea that what we're seeing is that women and women's bodies are bearing the brunt of men's desires, of their ambitions, of their passions, some of them misplaced, maybe a lot of them misplaced, most of them misplaced. That happens across both movies. I want to hear your thoughts about that. There's so much to say about Seven, I think the religious undertones are certainly something that we should tackle. Of course, seven is a reference to the seven deadly sins, and the murders follow these seven deadly sins, and that's the path we take. Jeff, curious to hear what you have to say about references to Dante and other narratives about hell, about the devil. One thing we could ask is whether or not they are, in fact, in hell. Is that where we are? Is that where we're living? There's something I think very unsettling about the fact that we don't really know where we are in this. And for me, that's where it skews horror. I mean, there's lots of other ways that this skews horror. I think for me, one of the most unsettling scenes that we'll get to talk about a little bit, or maybe we should avoid it, I don't know, is the lust scene. This is just, every time I see this movie, I'm just like, oh my gosh, this is the one. I can't, it's hard. But hopefully we'll find some joy. Jeff, I'm going to throw it to you. I want to hear your first takes on Seven. There's so much to talk about. We could talk about when you first saw it, or what were your impressions watching it again. What do you got, Jeff?
Yeah, if I'm being honest, I think this is the first time I've watched Seven since doing a PhD in medieval studies. Like, I remember watching it before going into grad school and learning all about the seven deadly sins in the Middle Ages and all these different texts and all these different representations of the seven deadly sins and how, frankly, important they are. If we were ever to talk about, I mean, I know you and I have talked about it, and I know there are obviously people in medieval studies who have talked about it, but if we were ever to, do an entire episode of medieval horror, I think you'd have to talk about the seven deadly sins, the ways in which they're imagined in horrific terms to try to turn people off from sinning, as it were. It's always interesting because like they tend to be much more interesting and they get a lot more attention than, say, what Somerset talks about, the seven cardinal virtues. Those don't seem to be nearly as fun. And, are either of these seven functional or functioning in the 21st century is maybe something we can get back around to, because, we like to think that we are so modern and so much more advanced than folks who would fixate on these seven deadly sins, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. But in many ways, like, I think a lot of the problems of our modern society could be boiled down to these very things. And maybe that's John Doe's point, played by Kevin Spacey in Seven. And Kevin Spacey's always such a fraught character, right? Because like he seems to be an awful human being from all accounts and from all the different predatory court cases against him. And that sucks because he's also an excellent actor. Like, whether it's House of Cards, whether it's Seven, whether it's American Beauty, perhaps like one of his greatest role, but then maybe that also is like a window into his sort of weird proclivities and stuff too. So I don't know. There's some weird meta horror going on there. Maybe we'll come back to this from the episode later. But I'm fresh off the International Congress for Medieval Studies at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, Michigan, the 60th meeting of that conference. And so I'm thinking about Seven Deadly Sins, and I'm thinking about Somerset discussing, he gives like these weird shout outs, right, to like the exact medieval text you would expect someone to talk about with hell, Dante's Inferno. He mentions Chaucer, which is not, frankly, Chaucer is not an author who takes up the seven deadly sins to any great extent. John Gower, maybe a little bit more so, given that 7 of the 8 books of his epically long, maybe not an epic really, poem, the Confessio Amantis, take up like all the 7 deadly sins-ish. Milton, yeah, that makes sense. Paradise Lost, right? Like all of these things. But that we've had, as humans, as at least Christianized humans, we've had a bit of a fixation with the 7 deadly sins. And to your point about where is this? Like, where is it set? We don't really know. To my mind, it's the darkest, dingiest, dankest setting for a film, maybe until we get to The Dark Knight or one of the Batman franchises, like when we get Gotham. Like this city that's nameless kind of reminds me of Gotham. Clearly, yes, listeners, I know Gotham is meant to reference New York City, but yeah, like this could be anywhere, and it's also nowhere. And that's how allegory works. That's how allegory works really well. So there is that, again, meta film quality, meta cinematic quality of it's a movie about allegory, but also the movie itself is an allegory. And that's, is this horror? Back to your question. So much of the stuff we discuss, most people wouldn't qualify as horror because the premise of what we're doing here, right, is discussing that horror is not just something that weirdos and psychos and sadists like. There is something really universal in many ways about horror. And to use horror with allegory, that just makes sense. Like that's how you try to scare people away from doing things. The threat of hell, the threat of punishment. That's horrific. What this movie does, and maybe what Memories of a Murder does more so, we'll get to later, though, like you mentioned, is we see how horror is played out on some male bodies, but actively we get it more often played out on female bodies in really horrific ways. Or perhaps, I guess we'll do a spoiler alert, even though this movie is it is 30 years old at this point. What happens to Stacy, Mill's wife, by the end? That's the active horror that's being perpetrated in the movie, right? Like what happens to her, his horror, the horror that's unleashed by his realization of what's happened. There's a double horror with him not knowing that Stacy was pregnant at the time. There's that scene earlier in the film where Somerset and Stacy discuss that she's pregnant, and Somerset tells her, if you don't keep the baby, don't tell him that you are pregnant. And so like there's a real fear there too. Like, I mean, it's weird, right? That 30 years later, we've regressed in women's reproductive rights. And there's something horrific about that. Watching this film in 2025, there is something actually scarier about the position Stacy's in now than perhaps it would have been in 1995 when Roe v. Wade was still law of the land. So, I mean, yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about the allegory and the seven deadly sins. I think there's a lot of connections to make between, the most horrific of the seven deadly sins in this film are not the ones that tend to play out more horrifically in the post-capital neoliberal hellscape we live in. That might be pride and greed, which don't seem to really, pride is pretty gross in this film, honestly. Yeah. But greed gets some attention, but not nearly the attention it deserves for the way in which it's like just wrought, unspeakable and countless horrors on modern life. So, and I'm going to turn back to you and ask you how you see this film maybe 30 years later speaking to some of the horrific things that happened then, maybe to our moment now, or maybe just to the ways in which we sort of get this in nowhere land, and how being in a nondescript, not named place allows this to be iterative in the sense that we can reconsider how these horrors could happen anywhere, do happen everywhere. Again, maybe John Doe's right. That really sucks. But, what do we do with this?
Yeah, that's really good. I think there's so many things to say. One, I want to talk about sin, how that works here, what we're actually talking about, because I don't think it's religious at all. Two, I want to talk about how we're seeing that now. In fact, I think that the sin aspect of it is important because it plays out so explicitly via the political lens and the capitalistic lens. And I want to talk about the anonymity as part of the internet, maybe. Like the internet is erupting in 1995. I know, again, 1996, sixth grade, I think that's when we first got the internet in our home. And at that time, the internet is being built in lots of ways through maybe anonymous stuff. Maybe that's a little bit later, but maybe you have insight there. I want to talk about that. So I want to shout out to, there's an article called 7 Medieval Justice, Modern Justice by Valerie Allen, and she has pointed out that Andrew Kevin Walker wrote the script. So this is a quote from this article. So Andrew Kevin Walker wrote the script for 7 as a cynical love letter to New York, the dirty, noisy metropolis in which he spent 5 years. Being miserable on its streets, he watched the 7 deadly sins performed daily, and this inspired the film, right? So I think there's something there. You're highlighting that this feels like New York. It is so gross and just decrepit. Like every building that they go in is run down. The walls are peeling. Like I think that's part of it, right? So if we're looking at the way that the city itself is crumbling like a body, right? The violence is played out across bodies. And this is where the sin comes in. I want to talk about that. But that it's also played out across the body of the city, right? The city itself is crumbling. And I think there's something about that where we get this political turn from the sin of the citizens to the body politic generally. The sin part, I think, is interesting because in both Memory of a Murder and in 7, we get this idea that what we're actually doing, right? The police officers are involved in capturing, chasing, interrogating those who are outside of the typical norms of society. So this happens more in Memories of a Murder explicitly from the police perspective. Who do they seek out? They seek out the person who's developmentally delayed. They seek out the man who has really soft hands. Maybe doesn't kind of express the typical kind of characteristics of masculinity, etc. We'll get to that. In Seven, though, there's something about sin here that's not related to God. It's not as if John Doe is preaching the gospel of Jesus, the coming of the kingdom of heaven, or a really theological claim. He is the harbinger of something better. He is just showing that he thinks that people in the city are living out sinful lives. And so it's unclear to me, what is this sinfulness? If it's a separation from God, that doesn't seem to be the case. Is it a separation from perfection? There's a sense in which the people in the city are not living up to some version of excellence. So I think maybe at the back of this, there is this kind of aristocracy, maybe even Nietzschean, kind of Ubermenschian, probably a really poor reading of Nietzsche as a nihilist or something like that. But all that to say, what is it that about the person who John Doe seeks out as the glutton, or the person he seeks out as prideful, or who does he seek out, right? It's these people that transgress what he takes to be the desired excellence? I'm not sure, right? And so who gets to decide that? So there's something about how that works out today for me, both in terms of the violence against women. There's a conversation, like you said, that is had in the cafe between Stacy and Somerset about abortion and how he pursued abortion with his partner and how maybe Stacy's going to be pursuing abortion as well. Is this a sin? And this is in part why they're being punished. There's something about that, I think, that plays out today, that the main sin, seemingly, that we see in society are the transgressions of norms via something like trans community or the queer community, or even with the Make America Healthy Again movement, unhealthy bodies. This is a sin, but also abortion is a sin, seen by a very conservative understanding of the political makeup of our society. What do we need to do? We need to make it better. How are we going to do that? We're going to just regulate bodies until we make them ask for forgiveness. At one point, Somerset says this is forced attrition. This is not as if people are actually asking for forgiveness. They're seeking God or perfection or anything like that. This is just somebody saying, you need to do X, Y, and Z. This is the power that we are going to play out on your body. I think that's something that Seven does really well. It's horrific, right? That's what I think makes this fit. What we're doing is that it's horrific in that way. That last thing, I don't know, where are they? They're in a nowhere land. Could this be something like the internet? The internet plays out lots of different things. So here we get Andrew Kevin Walker claiming that he sees things on the streets, but the anonymity of John Doe, the anonymity of the city, the lack of fingerprints, all of this stuff, I think there's something there. The final thing, I'll kind of throw this to you and open the conversation about time. So one of the things that I also read was this chapter in Kirsten Moana Thompson's book on apocalyptic dread. So the chapter is called Seven in the Morgue, Dystopian Dread, and something she talks about is future. And she says, Seven suggests the complete absence of a future, and said the film is set in a perpetual present tense, understood in terms of a serial, repetitive trauma. So here we are, we're in this kind of existential treadmill, right? We're just spinning our wheels, and we can never get out of it. Somerset is set to retire. He wants to seek some future. The Mills family is supposed to be having a kid, and they're going to be pursuing the future. At the end, Somerset seems like he's not retiring, and we're certainly not getting a kid from the Mills family. So is there something about time here? And of course, there's this scene where Somerset throws the metronome, the keeper of time, and breaks it. Again, this is maybe a question about breaking time, breaking the future. There's no future here. And if there's no future, that's bleak. And saying it out loud, the first thing that pops in my head, of course, is climate change. But there's so many ways in which thinking about the future is really hard right now. So, Jeff, I'll throw it back to you. There's a lot of stuff there. Take up any of it. Take us in a new direction.
Wow. Yeah. I think the near future, the thing that came into my mind immediately was Lee Edelman's book, No Future. It's a queer theory book from the late 90s or the 2000s. I should know the exact date. I don't. I have a really bad memory for dates. That could speak to maybe what you were saying about like bodies and the regulation of bodies and how particularly queer bodies, like, I mean, until recently, not always capable of reproduction, depending on, you know, your biological gender, I guess. And then anyway, getting away from that for a second, but I want to turn back actually to the article you referenced by Valerie Allen real quick, because shout out to Valerie Allen. I was on a roundtable podcast with her at the ICMS. So this is just really kismet, as it were, to have this article by Valerie showing up here. Shout out to the Canterbury Fails podcast with David Coley and Matt Hussey, who are at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, I want to say, or at least in British Columbia. Anyway, I want to look at this last paragraph of Allen's article here as a way of using medievalism to talk about time, because I think this is something that Thompson's chapter also speaks to, time in a way without using medievalism as our terminology here. So at the end of Allen's article, she writes, the grim medievalism operative in 7 relates to present reality not as discrete historical era, but as an unspeakable presence within, as the presence of a retaliatory justice that modern justice no longer allows itself officially to enjoy, as contempt for moral squalor denied by the laissez-faire belief in personal choice. And a little bit later, she concludes, John Doe, an alien inhabiting a liberal democracy, uncovers the bleak realization that the best its laws can do is to protect us from one another. They only prescribe, they do not transform human nature, and they do not make us good. That's actually this is the problem we're coming up against in 7. This is the problem that you're recognizing with like who decides what is a sin. This is why in many ways that the Christian nationalist segment of this country wants to move us towards a theocracy, because once you have a theocracy, then there is a deciding body who gets to decide what is right and what is wrong. Doesn't work as an enforcement mechanism in a government that has separation of church and state. It just does not, because then who decides? Like what does sin mean in, again, a liberal democracy? I think this too speaks to what you're bringing up with time. It seems like time is broken. It seems like time does not exist in this, with the chucking of the metronome, with the constantly finding these bodies who are being subjected to the 7 deadly sins, either too late or like, I mean, yeah, it's always too late. It's always already after the act. And then even seeing what's going to come at the end with Mills being antagonized by John Doe, like it's inescapable. It is going to happen. Like even Somerset realizes it. Somerset trying to attempt to stop it just cannot stop it. Even though, again, like maybe something to be said there for trying to stop time, trying to break time in order to end this cycle, to stop it from continuing to fulfillment. In the late 20th century, weird to say out loud, right? In the late 20th century, in the late 90s, whatever we want to say, what is it? Students say, back in the 90s or something, the late 1900s. That's what they say. Yes, in the late 1900s, we do see a lot of medievalism used. We still use medievalism in a sense of like trying to harken back to a time when either there were rules that we could more agree to, or we use it as a setting as the counterpoint to progress. It's not that simple. Nothing's ever that simple, right? But I think here with time, there is a fear about the future. It's 1995, 1996. We are approaching the new millennium. So there's always a fear about future. There's always a fear about, will the world end? We haven't, we've talked about Y2K in passing. We haven't actually done an episode on Y2K. Maybe at some point we do, but there is real fear. Like what does the future hold for us? I think this movie in many ways predicts what happens to society. In some ways it gets really right. In some ways it gets really wrong. Police state, for sure. We see that, especially now. Lack of like moral guides, whatever that means. We see that in some ways. And like, I'm not here to like try to police people's bodies, but I'm saying like more so in, we don't have agreed upon definitions anymore. Even like agnostically, we don't have a golden rule that we can all ascribe to. It's more about this like personal liberty. Personal liberty seems to be at the detriment to everybody else. The idea that corporations are people, like Citizens United. The idea that billionaires should exist and should be allowed to not pay taxes. So, the seven deadly sins that actually, again, get highlighted to their most grotesque ends in Seven are frankly the smallest of the problems that we have. Yeah, I mean, like, it's really daunting to think about how this film again is right in some ways, and like that's depressing, frankly, to be thinking about 30 years later. I think it's an anti-futurist film. I don't think that there's hope in this movie in those ways, and Fincher does this in a couple of his films. Like Seven's not the only one. Fincher tends to have this sort of dark, like a through a scanner darkly type look at things. So Brian, maybe get some final thoughts here on Seven before moving into Memories of a Murder. Anything there that I said that made sense? Give it back to you.
Yeah, I think I think a lot of what you said makes sense, and I think that thinking about the lack of futures for lots of different communities is important. I agree with you that this is not a hopeful movie. It just feels as if we are turning our wheels, and I don't know if Camus is laughing in the back saying we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Like, do we have to imagine Somerset happy? I'm not sure that we do, and I'm not sure what to do with it. But like you said, the project of Black futurism, the project of queer futures, I think it's important. And the narratives that are being told there need to be highlighted and celebrated, because the bleakness of living without a future, I think, is something that needs to be articulated and expelled, right? One thing that a thought that I had, and this is a little bit out of left field here, maybe you tell me. I've been reading Shock Doctrine by Naomi Klein, and this is a horrific book. And one of the things that she's talking about is crisis capitalism. And her claim is that what has happened is a manufactured crisis is the best way. And she says this like in the worst, right? She's not advocating for capitalism in any way, if you know Klein's work at all. Crisis capitalism is a mechanism, a terrible mechanism for ushering in hyper-capitalism. And so I fear what I saw in John Doe was this kind of, hey, what I'm going to do is I am going to generate a crisis for the sake of destroying the city in hopes of rebuilding it in some new way. So Klein talks about things like MK Ultra and some, psychological experiments that were going on that were trying to take people back to their infancy in order to rebuild them, to avoid whatever kinds of anxieties or things that they had. In crisis capitalism, again, there's this sense in which you create a crisis so that you can build up something new, hyper-capitalism, destructive capitalism, all of that stuff. Here, it seems similar, but it's a model that's used in lots of different ways. John Doe, creating a crisis for the sake of building something new. I'm going to show you what sin you have been living in for the sake of destroying you and hopefully building something better. I think this is a model used in lots of different ways that's terrible. And I think that's for me, one of the biggest kind of horrific elements of this movie is John Doe thinking that this is what we're going to do. I mean, another part of it is, Mills cannot keep himself from shooting John Doe. Again, sorry, spoiler alert, 30 years old, classic movie. The end is incredible. What's in the box, all that stuff. It's great. That scene is amazing and terrifying, right? But Mills cannot keep himself from committing that violence. He couldn't keep himself from breaking open the door when Somerset's like, look, this is going to break our investigation. There's something about Mills playing into, and John Doe knows this, the wrathful vengeance, that sin. But there's also this element of like, we have this idea that women shouldn't be in charge because they're too emotional, because their emotions would get the better of them. And here we are. Mills shows that that's just certainly the case with some men. Or is it that Somerset is a virtuous foil? Is he able to put his passions under the guidance of his reason? That's why everybody in the police department hates him. And that's why it grates against Mills in some way. Okay. I want to maybe move on to Memories of a Murder. Let's do that. I think Memories of a Murder is 2003, but it's set in 1986 in South Korea. And this is following what seems to be the first confirmed serial killer in that country. And we have this inept, kind of bad at their job detective duo. Jeff, like you mentioned, they're just drop kicking people all over the place. Like that's the first step, is to drop kick people. I don't know. I think something that's highlighted for me, and I want to throw it to you really quickly here, in Memory of a Murder, is the police tactics and the increased lack of trust that I think that the surrounding community ends up having in the police force. And for good reason, right? I think there's also an element of kind of anonymity. Where are we? They talk about Seoul as the big city, but it's really not very clear to me, at least. Of course, I just don't have a good grasp of the geography there, and that's on me. But there's something about this being out in the country. Where is this taking place? Who is it? Right. And so I think there's something about, again, the kind of distrust of the police that maybe we can talk about in broader terms. But what did you see, Jeff? Where do you want to jump in with Memories of a Murder? For me, this is the first time watching it, and I thought it was really good. I want to throw it to you. What do you think, Jeff?
I mean, I think everything you were saying there, for sure. First time I'm seeing it too. Had it recommended numerous times before. Obviously, very familiar with Bong Joon-ho's work through Parasite, most recently. A really interesting movie. I think it's not your lack of knowledge of the geography of South Korea. I think it's just meant to be in the sticks. I think they call it a few times in the movie. It's outside of Seoul. The expectation is our detective, not Park, but Sal. Is that how we say? I think so. Yeah. Sal Tae-yoon. When he arrives, Park asks us a few times, do you get this sort of stuff in Seoul? And he says, no, I've never seen anything like this before. There's a lot here with sort of the ineptitude of the existing cops in this area, as you mentioned. It's almost comic at times, which is jarring to watch as you are like watching this film that's about horrific things, about the murder of these women, about a serial killer, finding these bodies that are just maimed in different ways, altered, tied up, sexually assaulted, all of that. But these two cops, Park and Cho, are so bad at their jobs. They try to pin the murder on people who are different, as you mentioned earlier, to try to just be done with it. Like they seem to have little interest. I mean, Park seems to grow into the role. Cho is just the strength. He's the guy just like strong arm people, drop kicking everyone across tables. Like, again, I don't understand the drop kicking. It's very disarming. I mean, it would be, but it's very disarming when you're watching this film about sometimes very serious things, and suddenly here comes this guy just like drop kicking someone across the table, and you're like, okay, well, I didn't see that coming. And I do think at some point Park drop kicks someone down a hill. I think that's the first time he meets Sao. Just drop kicks him down a hill, as one does. We should try that. We should just try greeting each other by drop kicking each other to see how that works out. But yeah, that comedy aspect diffuses at times what's otherwise a really dark, heavy film. I think this actually is just sort of characteristic of Bong Joon-ho's directing. His movies all tend to have like this comic undertone or comic relief moment that does set aside the horror that we're engaging, the awfulness that we're engaging in its ways. I was reading an article by Reza Pourmikhail, Murder and Meaning, The Ordinariness of Violence and Memories of Murder. And that's in a collection called Serial Killers and the Serial Spectators from 2024. Pourmikhail makes this argument that there's something about this movie that is revealing the westernization of South Korea, in effect. The ways in which this movie responds to some of the more popular American detective stories that people would be familiar with there. And in some ways, how maybe South Korea at the time, the Republic of Korea, as it's called in the movie, is trying to resist this westernization. But then how it comes to fulfillment at the very end of the film, when we get Park's character, no longer a detective, in the year 2003, selling, I think, juicers when he stops on his way to a sales meeting with some folks to the original scene of the crime underneath the bridge. So Pourmikhail writes, in this sense, the perverse desire of the spectator of a serial killer film like this differs from the desires of the killer himself. The killer acts, the film, and it is all the more powerful for it, does not allow the killer's image to emerge. The meaning of the song, then, cannot be tied to the killer, but is instead tied to the audience in their grasping after something to construct about the killer and his motivations. So that's actually one of the interesting moments about this film. We don't actually have to find out who the killer is. We have all of these suspects. This is not like Silence of the Lambs, where we know who our killer is. This is not like Long Legs, where we find out who our killer is. Speaking to an earlier episode where we have kind of cop dramas with killers and whatnot. The serial killer's never found. I think we could watch the film again and perhaps look at some suspects who never get actually interviewed by the police. The pharmacist, for one, always sort of, watching through it, I'm thinking maybe it's the pharmacist, who would have soft hands. That's one of the clues we have, right? And there are otherwise not many. But there is something about this song that keeps playing too. It's Song in Rainy Days where these women are getting murdered. So this is like a serial killer's MO. We have to create that. But again, much like Seven, they are incapable of stopping the murders from happening. They know the MO. They can even call a statewide emergency to try to make everyone stay indoors, and it still does not work. People do not follow directions. People go out. People have to go out, and then people end up dying. And it breaks Sal by the end of the movie. Like, he's just completely broken, much like Mills is broken, frankly, by the end of Seven in his own way. So, Bride, let me pass this back to you, this hot potato, as it were. And how do we, what are the similarities we're seeing here? What are some of these elements of human nature being critiqued with either policing, with violence against bodies, with our inability to necessarily control evil, perhaps?
I think there's a couple similarities between Memories of Murder and Seven. The first one is like rain. Like, it's always raining in Seven. And there's part of me that wonders if this is like the desire to wash away the sins or baptism or something like that. I like what you're saying about Memories of a Murder in the sense that it creates a kind of ritual and meaning making, right? So the audience expects things to happen, and so it draws you in. Oh, it's raining again. Is there a causal relationship? Is there an accidental relationship? What's the deal with rain? I think that's important as a meaning making mechanism. I think that's really good. I think that there's the assumptions made by the police officers. So Mills is always talking about whoever's doing the crime, whoever's doing the killing, whoever's setting up these gruesome scenes is insane, crazy, a lunatic. And Somerset keeps saying, no, hold on. You got to hold off that judgment. And even when he meets John Doe on the ride out to the trailer, into the desert, or wherever they're going, Mills turns to him and says, do you know how crazy you are? And again, there's an assumption about the other person that you are a deficiency based on our societal norms. And I think that that's something that happens in Memories of a Murder quite often. Like you're saying, Park continues to make assumptions about the person who's developmentally delayed, about the person who doesn't perform masculinity in the way that they think they should, with soft hands and all that stuff. The person who is taken as a pervert, a sexual pervert in some way, out of their home and treated as the person. It must be them because they're just outside of the norms, and I can't even imagine that this person would act sanely or so. So there's these assumptions by the police officers. Where I think it differs is in part the sinfulness. The judgment about one's sinfulness is, I think, made more clearly and explicitly in Memories of a Murder. Again, not related to God, not related to fallen nature or anything like that, but just in terms of like, I'm making the judgment as the police officer based on the fact that you don't meet the standards of normalcy. Therefore, you are some way a sinner and should be judged for it. I think that Mills does this assumption about the crazy lunatic person, quote unquote, right? But the cops in Memories of a Murder, I think, do this more explicitly. And again, like you're saying, CO just does this differently. He tries to hold back his judgment. By the end, he tries to do the same thing. But there's all this kind of desire by the police department to plant evidence, to torture their suspects into confessing. And I think there's something here about confession that we should talk about, especially kind of in line with our discussion with Stephen Graham Jones, the desire for confession, both in Mills' case and maybe in CO's case and a little bit in Park's case. What we get is this desire for truth. The assumption is that there's some true thing out there and I'm going to find it. And that's the most important thing. Regardless of the consequences of my actions, finding the truth, understanding who did it, that's the most important thing. If I have to torture it out of somebody, so be it. If I have to knock down doors against procedure, so be it. I'm going to do it. So I think there's something there about going on here in terms of maybe the judgments that are being made about society. One is from John Doe and the other is from the police officers themselves. I don't know, something that I thought was a little bit striking about Memories of a Murder is that sometimes it felt like the detectives were the only people in the department. Like in Seven, it feels as though the police officers, the police buildings were some of the only buildings that were kept up. And there were a lot of police around, helicopters, SWAT teams, and everybody's very excited about being a police officer. In Memories of a Murder, it felt like a little bit empty. Like sometimes they were the only people. And I don't know what to say about that. Like, I don't know if that's just, if it speaks to not being in a city, but being kind of out in the country or what. But yeah, I'm not sure why that struck me as compelling or interesting, but yeah, anyway, it did. I will say that I love watching Song Kang-ho, who plays Park in Memories of a Murder. He does this kind of bungling cop thing really well. He does it in a different way in The Host. He does it in a different way in Parasite. And he just does it really well. There's something really interesting about that. So when we get to Joy, maybe I'll talk about that. But Jeff, for now, any final thoughts about Memories of a Murder? Anywhere else you wanted to go with it?
Yeah, I just have two thoughts, and we might have to use a philosophy alert here, coming from the English professor. But first, I want another article I came across prepping for Memories of a Murder is by Christina Klein. Why American Studies Needs to Think About Korean Cinema or Transnational Genres in the Films of Bong Joon-ho. It's from American Quarterly in 2008. She says, she flames, quote, slowly the viewer realizes that the true subject of the film is not the serial murders and the detective's investigation, but rather daily life in the late 1980s, that is, during the darkest years of Korea's military dictatorship. The deep crimes revealed during the course of investigating the surface crime include the corruption and abuse of police power, the casual disregard of civil rights, and the government-stimulated fear of North Korea as a means to keep the civilian population in check. And what made me think about this quote from Klein's article is what you were saying there about the department seeming empty at times. The chief at one point calls to try to get a bunch of backup to come in during one of the rainy days with the song playing, and he's told, yeah, everyone's about putting on protests or dealing with students here or dealing with, a protest there. So it's at once both a police state, but also in like an under-resourced police state in some strange ways. Again, like there are a lot of parallels we might look at in 2025 United States of America. Like, unfortunately, we're not necessarily a military dictatorship, but we tend to, and here's where I'm going to bring in some philosophy, if you'll indulge me, listeners, and Brian. This is kind of what Gilles Deleuze, where he takes Foucault's idea of the panopticon, where we are moving away from just discipline and punishment, if you will, to a society of control. So in the 21st century, with, again, maybe this speaks to some of what you're talking about with the internet, Brian, and the fact that, there's anonymity, but also everything's being recorded and also everything's available to everyone all at once. You don't really need a military or a bunch of police officers in the year 2025 to effectively have a police state. You have this assumption of control. Again, the society of control, where we're being surveilled, we're being watched at all times. And that's the expectation, or at least it ought to be the expectation. And that's something that you and I have seen develop in our lifetimes. Folks our students' age, so, Gen Zers and younger, that's just been their way of life. Like, they've always grown up with the expectation that they're always being recorded, they're always being surveilled. Their life's been documented on Facebook by their parents in many ways. The photos are out there on the internet at all times. It's only recently, even in public schools and colleges, where we have to have our students sign forms to be recorded for permissions. Like, that's something we kind of realized a little late, that, we should be asking people for permission to use their image and likeness or to have themselves recorded and put on websites and the like. But yeah, so I'm seeing a similar effect, a similar state of being, if you will, if coming from very different causes in both like what we're seeing here in 2025, but what we see very explicitly in Memories of a Murder, and maybe what's sort of just nascent in Seven. Because Seven, again, 95, Memories of a Murder, 2003. 2003 is after the beginning of the War on Terror. 2001, Brian, my pet thesis that the world sort of just breaks with 9/11, and media before 9/11 and media post 9/11 are like markedly different. And again, maybe something to come back to at another point, but I think you're right. It is probably time that we move into finding some joy in all of this. But before we do that, I just want to see if you have anything, as our resident philosopher, in response to this concept maybe of society of control with Deleuze.
I don't have much in terms of Deleuze, but I do think I want to make the full circle kind of point with Klein in the sense that I think like what you're saying, not only is it about control, right? So through Foucault and Deleuze, we get somebody like Jean Baudrillard, who writes about simulacra and simulation, and he talks a lot about the way that we are making meaning in the world, and so the signifier is the thing that we are taking up. So we're just taking up the world of meaning, and the thing itself has receded fully. And so again, we get this in the internet, we get this via control, because everybody is now not only observing others, but they are self-observing. So, right, the whole panopticon thing is I have to act as if I'm being observed. If I'm observing everybody else online and their activities there, I'm now performing in such a way that I'm going to be observed. And so I think there's something about control. The Klein stuff, I think, comes in with explicitly state power, right? We're seeing this with ICE. We're seeing this with other kinds of police agencies that are demanding to be the quote unquote law and order. But what we're seeing is that it's quieting people, disappearing people. It is an attempt to make dissent something that is illegal. And so I think there's definitely control here. And again, the crisis capitalism bit is that if we destroy the systems, if we shock the system enough, then we can come in and do whatever we want. Usually it's privatizing what used to be state-run things. We put it to the states, but now we're going to privatize everything. And that's actually going to be really good for a very, very small amount of people and really bad for most everybody else. That's how the history of this has worked so far. So again, all that to say is, right, the protests and the things going on, the police state, the sense of control, I think it maps onto some stuff that's happening here now in the United States, and that's certainly troubling and worrisome. All right, I'll start us off with joy, if that's okay with you. Let's run into it. I think 7 can be really difficult to find joy in. It's bleak and it's dark and it's disturbing. I think that the acting is really good. And Brad Pitt is always is he a good actor? Is he not a good actor? I'm not sure, but he certainly has charm for sure. Morgan Freeman is great as that foil to Brad Pitt. Like you said, Kevin Spacey, is he acting creepily or is he just creepy? I don't know, but he does a great job. All of that's there. I think Gwyneth Paltrow's in there as she's like a rising star in 1995. She's not in it a lot, and I think that actually plays an important role because like you know her in some way, and then she's not there, but you also get the feeling that her absence at the end is a shock, right? This is such a well-written movie, well-made movie. I mean, I think finding joy in something artistically created in a way that's just compelling, it makes you feel what it wanted to make you feel, right? There's that sense of control there. For me, there's something joyful about participating in a successful artistic project. Again, watching Memories of a Murder, I liked going back to early Bong Joon-ho's work. Have seen a lot of his other stuff. Personally did not like Mickey 17. That's his most recent one, but that's me. I found it a little bit boring. This one was really good. Just a well-told story. I like Song Kang-ho. His kind of bungling cop with depth is really well done. And there's some joy in that, the drop kicking for sure. I will say that watching the food in a lot of Korean cinema is something that I really like. And this one is no different. The noodles and all the things that they eat, there's just something food-centric about this movie, but other movies, The Wailing comes to mind, Exuma. These movies make me think of food for some reason. I don't know. There's joy for me always in food, and so I like watching that. Jeff, I'm going to throw it to you. What did you find today that was joyful?
Yeah, I mean, I'll echo what you said with 7, the acting. I don't know that Brad Pitt's a very good actor. I think Brad Pitt is an object lesson in how you can act your way into acting. Like his more recent films, I think he has become a better actor than he was in the 90s. I think he's better in Fight Club, perhaps, than in this film. And this film, like, he reminds me of a guy just playing like a very angry young cop, which is, I mean, maybe he's playing the part. Maybe that's just the part. Morgan Freeman, awesome, always to watch. It's fun to think that 30 years ago, Morgan Freeman was thought of as the wise old African-American man, and he's still that. Like, he's played this part for most of his career. He's just a phenomenal actor, national treasure. Yeah, I mean, I already gave my thoughts on Kevin Spacey, so I'm not going to go back to that. Gwyneth Paltrow, I mean, who would have ever guessed she'd eventually be trying to peddle goop on the internet? But here we are. I think I'm going to take maybe a meta joy approach to both this film and then also Memories of a Murder. And it's something that I'm reminded of, particularly given of the field I work in with medieval studies, is that history is long. And when you're in the moment of history, you don't always recognize that it feels very long, but it's kind of a small blip as far as the larger scheme of things goes. And if you look back to a film from the mid-90s and a film from early 2003 that are dealing with some of the issues that we're still dealing with in 2025, perhaps my joy is from that this moment has been going on longer than we've realized, and that we are perhaps reaching the end of it and eventually going to come out, have the pendulum swing the other way into something better, something that will move us beyond late stage capitalism, which we've been in for, yikes, 40 years at this point, over 40 years, beginning with Reagan and just kind of slowly decaying ever since then. Maybe this is finally the death knell for trickle down this, trickle down that. Maybe we finally end the kleptocracy, the oligarchy, all of these things that we're hearing people finally talk about in terms to the public, rather than acting like the public doesn't understand these terms, but just actually explaining what these terms are, because people are like, oh yeah, that's exactly what we've lived in our entire lives. I think there's joy and there's hope in seeing that films have been talking about these things in a number of ways for a long time now, and maybe we are going to finally break through to the public writ large and to get some progress to come out of the dark allegory that has been a lot of cinema, but also that has been a lot of American life for the last 40 years. So, you know, in some cases, horror is too close to home. I think for right now, for many folks, you know, I think you and I are privileged in some ways to don't have to worry about these things. At least I'll speak for myself as a white guy. I am super privileged in the sense I don't have to worry about ICE agents knocking on my door or pulling me over at a traffic stop if I'm traveling to take me away somewhere. You know, a lot of folks, that's unfortunately a concern they have right now, who are American citizens, but just because of the color of their skin or the language they speak, they have to deal with these true horrors. And that's not joyful. But I think, you know, something about Memories of a Murder, when you realize how inept sometimes the people making these decisions are, there's a weird, almost like an anti-joy, like where it's joyful and yet also not joyful at the same time, where people are really bad at their jobs, like the Tom Homans of the world, always 3 sheets to the winds, Tom Homan or Pete Hegseth, like they're not good at their jobs. And so even though they're terrible people and they are trying to do awful things, I think we can take joy in their ineptitude and use that as our small tactics, our subversive tactics to get through to the other side. So my joy is, I mean, these are both quality films, watching them. So aesthetically, yes, exactly what you're saying, Brian. Highly joyful in those regards. But also I think there's joy in knowing that this could be just, these are some of the cultural markers of perhaps finally breaking through to what's next, rather than continuing to dwell in the dark allegory of a rainy, dingy, dark city in which everyone is ultimately miserable for different reasons, which is not joyful. So Brian, final thoughts? Job's done. What do you think?
I really love what you're saying at the end there. There's something about the hope for the future that is not in Seven, but that we might have. And so keeping that hope alive is joyful. Having an idea that what we're doing is highlighting these things and hopefully getting to the other side. I definitely want to acknowledge that there's a lot in quote unquote cop horror that we could have done in terms of, like you just said, the way that policing has worked on other bodies, black bodies, queer bodies, brown bodies, being mixed race, biracial, Japanese American. We're the myth, right, of the model minority and all that stuff. Yeah, privilege for sure in that regard. But I do think we've done a lot of good work. Talked about Seven, the bleakness, the atmosphere, the aesthetic, the lack of hope there, but also memories of a murder and what's going on there. I think pairing these two together has been really kind of interesting. And honestly, this conversation has been really, really good and joyful for me. Hope that's true for all of you out there. Jeff, final thoughts. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm just reminded, I'd be remiss if I did not to give a shout out to, we're speaking of joy and finding joy in perhaps horror and in moments of horror. Great book I've just started reading called Carbon by Paul Hawken. You were talking about different ways of understanding the world, whether it's through queer or trans bodies or Afrofuturism, or one of the things that Carbon does is it thinks to indigenous models of reciprocity and the ways in which we exist in the world. So not horror, but highly joyful. Paul Hawken's Carbon. Just back to you.
I love that. That's great. I think that's it though for this episode. So if you want to reach out, let us know. Something we got right, something we got wrong, things you liked, things you didn't. I don't know. Reach out. As always though, find joy even in horror. Bye folks. This has been an episode of Horror Joy, produced in conjunction with Axis Mundi Media. Thanks for joining us. We want to hear from you. You can find us at Horror Joy Pod on Instagram or at Horror Joy Pod on YouTube. You can also email us at horrorjoypod@gmail.com, all one word. And you can, of course, find us wherever you get your podcasts. Give us a like, subscribe, leave a review. Until next time, remember, seek joy, even in horror.